Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. You are here on Rashkin Report. I'm glad to welcome you to this broadcast, this live stream. And today we're going to be discussing situation surrounding Ukraine, figuring out why Ukraine still matters. And to do this, I am excited to welcome to the program Jason J. Smart, who is a correspondent of Kiev Post. Jason, welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you, Yuri.
Yes, and as a little bit of backstory, we've met as panelists on actually I think different programs on Ukrainian television, and I thought, well, this is awesome. We should speak. We should have a conversation, and figuring out which language. Decided to go with English, although you speak fantastic Russian and appear frequently, on Russian speaking channel on that level. So. Very impressive. Can you tell in just a few words, or as many as you'd like, I guess, what made you interested in the subject of Ukraine and kind of a little bit of your background?
Sure. I've been traveling to Ukraine since, I guess, about 2005-ish. And I've been regularly going back and forth, been living there for years. And I got into Ukraine. Actually, I was into former Soviet states after the fall of the Soviet Union. Young. I wasn't really that around for the fall of the Soviet Union. I was in school. But when I was in college, I did study Russian, and I was selected to go study in Russia for a U.S. government program. And following that, I started to work with the Russian opposition in Russia, which got me thrown out of the country. And that also banned me from going to Belarus back in 2010 or 2009. I'd always, to be fair, liked Ukraine more. And I was already spending a lot of time there. So I just kept doing more and more projects in Ukraine. And, the years passed by.
That's incredible. And here you are, practically a war correspondent. Did you ever think that could be something that would be part of your life plan?
Never would have expected to have anything to do with wars or with military and any of these things. So it's all been quite a surprise.
Did you think the war was going to last as long as it has?
I guess I did not think it would last this long. To be fair, when the war began, I was very worried, reading the Western assessments, reading, what the White House had said, that, Ukraine would face this onslaught. And I was really concerned that the West would fail Ukraine like it had in 2014. I was tremendously concerned that there might not be significant reaction. They wouldn't give weapons. They wouldn't give ammo. They wouldn't give humanitarian support, economic support. All these things have been crucial for Ukraine to be able to continue fighting. And so I was worried that if the West was not going to budge and was not going to really do more than, offer strongly worded statements and some sanctions, that, eventually just by the mass of Russia, this would turn into something like a partisan war over a period of time and then become, fighting a Russian occupation of many cities. That being said, I do think that now that they are receiving the weapons that they've needed this whole time and have been asking for 9 years, I am not surprised that this war is continuing as it is. That being said, I don't think that the war is likely to continue for much longer.
Now, that is a big statement because I think that administration is preparing us for the long haul. And I'm kind of curious again, well, how do you feel like what makes you say that then?
Well, so the war can end in just really two different ways. One is that, Ukraine either has victory, it takes back all of its territory. And at that point, Russia decides no longer wants to keep fighting for them. The second option is that Russia decides it no longer wants to keep fighting for this war. And I've thought that the first variant is going to be a low probability in the near term, due to the fact that simply there's not the resources necessary to do that yet. The West has still not supplied Ukraine with things like F-16s, ATACMS, and other things, other support. That being said, I think that the second option, that Russia no longer wishes to fight the war, is very realistic. But it will not become because of Vladimir Putin deciding this was an error and asking for apologies. No, what's going to happen, I think more likely, is that one of three factors will come to play. Either there'll be the economic collapse of Russia. Look at the ruble. Today, again, it surpassed 91 to the dollar. At the beginning of the year, it was about 64 to the dollar. The ruble has lost a significant amount of value. The economy of Russia is really in dire straits. China has indicated that it's unable to continue helping Russia as it has before. Look at the debt at the local level, specifically in construction, at the municipal level in China. The country does not have the ability to prop up Russia indefinitely. And their demand to keep buying rubles to keep the currency stable, that is to say, keep the Russian ruble stable, is very low. Second to that, I think there's another factor that could come into play, which is a military collapse, such as we saw with Prigozhin's team. Why that all fell apart is a different question. But something like that is real. The Institute for a Study of War today said that there is a growing degree of disobedience within the ranks of the Russian military, of people no longer following orders. And this is significant. The fact that a number of senior officers have been replaced, have been arrested. We read in Russian Telegram, if you read what the Russian war correspondents are saying, and they've expressed that they are very unhappy with how the Kremlin is executing this war. And I think Putin has made a serious, very serious error to continue supporting Shoigu, who is widely disliked. He's not trusted. He's not a military expert. And his blunders in this war and his personal corruption, which has cost Russia greatly. This at some point could turn to senior leadership of the military turning against the government. And the third option would be political change. I think that there's a real chance of something like a coup in Russia or the overthrow of the government by one group of oligarchs or one group of elites against another. But either one of those three factors, whether it's political, economic, or military, would signal the end of this war because Russia simply would no longer be able to continue fighting the war.
I think that that's a wonderful summary, and I think that you're right. But I don't know because it has lasted as long as it has, and it seemed like this was always a giant on legs of mud that was going to fall apart, and yet here we are, and it seems like Russian presence now is bigger than it was, and the number of troops is growing on some numbers, but you think that this could all end soon nonetheless? What gives you confidence now versus just that we're that much further into the war?
The Russians, especially leadership of the military, they see that it's one blunder after another. They see that they're being badly managed, they're being badly supported. They see that money that's being allocated to them is still being stolen from them. They see that the supply lines are not working the way they should and have not been improved. And due to these factors, even a general, he might be the most gung-ho pro-Putin person, but then a day he wants to live as well, as does an enlisted person. And now that they themselves are seeing that these enlisted people don't survive, especially those who are conscripted, I think that the increasing desire of them to just go fight this war. Many of them obviously do believe that they're going to go do something. They don't have this perception of how bad it's going to be. But now that they're getting more and more feedback, they are recognizing that the situation is bad, that the government's unable to support them and is unwilling to. The returning veterans to Russia are not being supported out there either. So is it really worth it? And if your currency is devaluating at the rate that theirs is, and you realize that your salary is no longer be sufficient to support your family back in Russia, is it really worth going to do this? Is this really in your best interest? And I think that if you look at the history of coups, especially military leaderships, when there's some sort of overthrow of power, they do have a lot of things going on that would make that possible. I mean, you have a heavily armed group of people as soldiers. You have very unhappy ones called veterans who are also armed, did take weapons back to Russia, it looks like. And the potential for that to turn into something like a real rebellion is significant. And I'll say for you one example of why I'm optimistic. Prigozhin's invasion of Russia 3 weeks ago, there's a few things that happened that were truly startling, aside from the whole fact that he stormed Russia, was one, think about all the failures of the security state that occurred. So you had Prigozhin before he was planning this, as we know, the Germans were listening to his conversations, the Americans were listening to his conversations. But we know that the FSB and the GRU, the military intelligence of Russia, did not pick up on this until about the day before, it looks like. So there's a failure of the security apparatus. Then they crossed into Russia, which means the border guards of Russia did not stop them. They went through multiple checkpoints. The Russian military didn't stop them. The National Guard of Russia did not stop the Prigozhin people. We look at the local police. They did not stop Prigozhin's people. The national police didn't stop Prigozhin's people. The Kadyrov soldiers that are coming from Chechnya stopped. They spent 5 hours to go 100 kilometers. They just didn't want to get there. They didn't want to fight. We look at the senior Russian leadership, or military leadership, I should say, generals, who are sitting there drinking coffee with Prigozhin, saying, you really shouldn't do this. This isn't a good idea. But they weren't threatening. They didn't order, air support to come and start bombing his headquarters where he's located. In fact, they sat there and conversed with him. And now we've seen all the different senior Russian leadership that's been arrested from the military due to perhaps colluding with Prigozhin's coup attempt. But I think more important than all that is the Russian people themselves. We saw that they brought food to Prigozhin's people. They brought water to Prigozhin's people. And we saw that once Prigozhin's people pulled out of Rostov, they started rioting against the police and telling the police to leave. They didn't want them. There is a serious undercurrent, a popular undercurrent, against the current government in Russia.
I just conducted an interview with retired General Ben Hodges, and I asked him about his takeaways from Prigozhin's mutiny. And he was saying that it showed how quickly Putin is willing to reach a deal when cornered. And this is another, I think, an interesting sign of potential weakness of the regime. Well, it seems that fear is one of those Russian staples, like greed and fear. And it's either we can make some money, or they're going to get us, or we can make some money, or they're going to get us. And right now, it's more the fear that they're stuck there. They have to be, I think for Americans, it's hard to understand that there's a part of Russian army that whose job is to shoot those that are running back. It's
So
just it's fear driven.
it does not inspire confidence. And I think that's actually another aspect of this. If you're a soldier in the Russian army, listen, these people are brainwashed. There's no doubt. That being said, they're not zombies. They do have a pulse. They can see what's going on. And if you see that the Russian military is marching you off to die, now there's got a big problem, by the way, is that historically they use Prigozhin's people from the prisons, etc., to go get killed. And yes, it is a fact. They sent them out to a field to see where artillery would come in from Ukraine, so they knew where to target the Russian artillery against the Ukrainian artillery. But they're using these people literally as cannon fodder. That's probably going
I
to be
know.
much
I
harder.
for so long used that as a figure of speech, figuring it was really a good way to describe what's going on. But it's almost literally what's going on.
It's literally what's going on. But now it's going to be harder to do without Prigozhin's people there. Now you don't have tens of thousands of soldiers. Prisoners. You have real soldiers. You have normal people who are coming from normal families. They're running out of supplies of people they could pull from the backward republics that they don't care about, the backwater republics, I should say. They don't care about, out Siberia. Now they have to take people from more and more of their ethnic Russians, which is going to be a problem for them because now the larger Russian population is going to become aware of the fact this war has had atrocious cost for Russia. And, just day by day, they are seeing in the streets more and more Russians without legs and arms walking around due to this war. This war is no longer something that's going to be hidden. And it's certainly not a 3-day, coup where Putin just drops in and shows them who's boss. No, quite the opposite. He's showing how totally destabilized his country has become.
Can you talk a little bit about how this is seen from Ukraine? Because even though, I guess what I'm trying to say is with Russia, they are sending their worst to fight. Ukraine sends their best. What is the impact on the society that lives in the state of war now for a year and a half? And to what extent are these people willing to continue to send their best to the front to possibly die, but to fight for freedom? Is there a point at which people of Ukraine will feel that they've had enough?
So that's a good question. I was also very curious how that would all play out. And so far, no. All the polling indicates is that it has not been the case. Quite the opposite is that now there's a desire to have revenge, that these people didn't die for a forsaken cause, that it's something that more than ever is something that needs to be avenged. And I do see that in the population. And when you talk to people, I think that there is more pragmatism now in the sense that people in Ukraine, we just talked to them on the street, taxi drivers, people do say, okay, this might not be as fast as we wanted. This is not going to be exactly the way we hoped. There's not going to be Deus Ex Machina. We joined NATO and this will just stop. This is going to be a much harder grind than we would have hoped. That being said, I've not met anyone yet in the population who said, we should just call it quits today and let them keep what they've taken. And I mean that sincerely. So far, I've not met a single person who said that. So I think that's a pretty strong show of the popular sentiment that this war is something that they must fight. And I think they're absolutely right. If they were to stop today, Russia would only be further enticed to further invade the country, a year from now or something, once they're able to rebuild their military. And I think that would also just open up the people who are living under Russian occupation to live with the horrors, such as the people of Bucha did, where we've seen the stories of the mass graves, the civilians that were shot with summary executions, the mass rape of men, women, and children. And I think that, how would you decide to let your citizens go to that fate? You've got to continue fighting for them.
Well, then in that case, let's take a look at the topic of our discussion, which is why does Ukraine still matter really to us? I mean, we know Ukraine matters to Ukrainians because that's their place. And we know why it matters to Russia, because they need more territory, because, the biggest country in the world is not enough. Got to have more land. It's that kind of a mindset. But fine, there's consequences. Watch. But why does Ukraine matter to the United States, and does it still matter to us? It hasn't been cheap. It's been very expensive, and even though Ukrainians are continuously expressing how they need more and more and more, and I understand because Russia has been preparing for this for a long time. But can you tell me why you feel Ukraine still matters?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, and outside of the humanitarian aspect of why Ukraine should matter, we can speak in pragmatic terms, the realist politic of why it's in the interest of the U.S. to continue supporting Ukraine. And I think first and foremost is at this point, we are heavily invested in it. That is absolutely the case. But if Russia realizes that it is able, despite all its investment, to convince us to pull out now, be absolutely certain that this war will start again within a few months, maybe a couple of years, and it will not get better. At that point, the U.S. will be perhaps even a worse situation. To those ends, I think that Russia's ultimate goal is pretty clear. After Ukraine was, for instance, Moldova, and assuming that Moldova was a quick turn, it would probably end up being somewhere like the Baltic states, in which case NATO would get involved. So that would be much more costly for the United States. It is a much cheaper investment to get involved with this now as an optional cost versus getting involved in this due to legal obligation for NATO membership, per our NATO membership. To those ends, I think that Russia itself has now at this point fighting with Ukraine now inside of Ukraine is something that is in the best interest of the U.S. Because if this war were to spill over, if we had Americans get involved in this, if it was a NATO war, I think that this would turn out so differently. I think that the chance of this becoming a very serious, very grave global war would be almost, it would happen. It would be almost within moments. And so by keeping it localized to Ukraine is something that serves the U.S. interest. Unfortunately, it's a very cynical way of looking at these things. So why Americans, I think, that are opposed to this, specifically those in politics, who say it's too much money we're spending in Ukraine, I would argue quite the opposite. It's the cheapest investment. And if you look at the European countries and why we have NATO to begin with, it was really due to Soviet, that is Russian, threat. That is why it exists. And so at this point, the Russian military is being completely destroyed. And it is really getting beat up. It is losing a lot of equipment and a lot of talent. That's good because it also reduces the chance for future conflict with the West vis-a-vis NATO.
How do you feel about the relevance of China to this conversation? They are not officially, anything. They're standing supposedly outside and, trying to do their business, economically taking over the world. But to whatever extent it is possible, you mentioned briefly that they're having their challenges as well. But it seems to me that, correct me if I'm wrong, that we are doing this to Russia so that China would take notice. Because otherwise, this is going to get much more difficult and much more expensive. And the problem that we have with Russia could be substantially scaled if we have to do it with China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think everyone's made that argument before, but I totally agree with you, is that look at the case of Taiwan. If the U.S. were to pull out of this now, why would they possibly not try to take Taiwan next? The U.S. has, earlier, we made some various guarantees to their security. So what would that do? I mean, we do know Putin did highlight. I mean, this has come up in almost all the research of how the decision was made to invade Ukraine. Pulling out of Afghanistan was one of the reasons. The Americans just picking up and leaving Afghanistan was shocking. The Kremlin was surprised that the U.S. lacked resolve. But that only further convinced them that it was necessary to launch this war because the West would not have the resolve to continue supporting Ukraine. And by the way, if you look at the most major enemies of America, I could say, is whether if we look at the Vietnam War, that was the strategy, was that it was going to be millions of ants biting at the elephant that would eventually take down the elephant. Just one loss after another loss. And if you read books about Osama bin Laden, his strategy was, yes, he's never going to have an attack that's going to just destroy the United States, but multiple attacks in the United States throughout the Middle East and on U.S. interest in the homeland will be something that eventually convinces Americans to pull out of the Middle East because it's not worth staying there. Russia views the world the same way. The more that it can make this painful, the more likely that they will just drop it and say, this is too high for our pain threshold. We're out of here. And if we give that sign to China, trust me, they will pick up on it and they will take advantage of it.
I'm a little concerned, and it's interesting that you brought up Vietnam, because I think of Vietnam from a different point of view, which is that in America, people were told by politicians that we need to fight them there, so we don't have to fight them over here, that this is the expansionist politics of Soviet Union. And now, over a period of time, we wonder, I think, to what extent that was really true. And I think that we have really good relationships with Vietnam now. So how does all of this work out in terms of we still must support Ukraine? You know?
Well, I think that's quite a bit different, though. In the case of Vietnam, in the case of Asia, all of East Asia, like what the U.S. bombing of Cambodia, for instance, this was all an attempt. There was an ideology, or I should say rather, a hypothesis of domino theory that once one country fell, the other ones would all fall, right? And in Asia, there was a serious concern of that because there was expansion. At this point, we're not dealing with an ideology is one thing. We're dealing with a different set of rules. Secondly, we do see that the Soviets were dealing with something different. In the case of Latin America, there was the American plan called Operation Condor in 1975, which was to rid Latin America leftist. Once again, it's something that the U.S. doesn't do today. Why? Because we're not worried about Cuban's communist method being spread around the rest of Latin America. At this point, that's not really a huge concern of anybody. Today, though, what we would be concerned by is that if one country can show force and use force to dominate another one, especially a key opponent of the United States does that would give them the right of way to do that in other countries as well. So it's a different situation. It's not about the spread of an ideology. Rather, it's what is permissible underneath international law.
All right. What about this? Ukrainians that I have spoken to seem not very high on the likelihood that Vladimir Putin will use nuclear weapons. In either way, it just doesn't seem like it bothers them like it bothers us here in the United States.
It's surreal.
Can you talk about that?
That's actually surreal. That's actually a really good question. So I have talked to a lot of Ukrainians who say, yeah, he'll probably end up using them at some point. And I say, and so what do you think about that? They go, well, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. Not much you can do about it. And it's sort of this resignation to fate, which I find to be quite relieving, actually, compared to the U.S. media, which gets so hyped about these issues. The Ukrainians, who would be the ones on the receiving end of that attack, it does not in any way influence how they believe this war should be executed. I mean, you have one of two options when you're being attacked. You can either accept it and accept that you're being beaten, attacked, and murdered and raped, or you say, we're going to stand up against it. And they say, well, how about if he kills you? Well, listen, they're already trying to commit genocide. I mean, what really could get worse at this point? And I don't think it could. I don't see any downside for Ukraine to keep fighting, even if nuclear weapons were to be used, which I don't think that Putin would do, largely because he would lose the support of China, and it would cost him too much. That actually might cause the collapse of his country.
Does it mean that the West then, therefore, should be less concerned about using nuclear weapons, or do we just have different priorities?
Well, I think we should be concerned, of course, but I think the way that we're concerned about it should be different. I think that the way that we can assure that they're not used is to continue using third parties such as China to lobby the Russians as to why that's against their own interest, but to also remind them of what the consequences would be. As Ben Hodges, you mentioned earlier, General Hodges, I have also spoke to him about this before, and I've asked what he thought the reaction of the U.S. would be should nuclear weapons be used. And I've interviewed a couple other generals who have worked in the theater, and they've come to pretty much similar answers. They said that the U.S. response would probably be along the lines of destroying virtually all of the Russian positions inside of Ukraine itself, just immediately, and then destroying the Black Sea Fleet. And it would be such a substantial.
I've heard the same thing. Yeah. Goodbye, Black Sea Fleet. Yeah.
And so if you lose your entire Navy, plus you lose 100,000 troops, was it really worth it? What did you gain? At that point, Ukraine actually, it's really sort of non-pleasant thing to say, but it's probably true, is that Ukraine at that point, I think we will retake the country very, very quickly. Because at that point, there's simply not enough Russian troops left to be able to defend the points they currently have. They would be obliterated. And so Ukraine actually could retake Crimea and eastern Ukraine in a very short period of time.
Now, what about the fact that this fear thing that I mentioned earlier in terms of Russian soldiers, Russian society, but it is really like a powering force. And therefore, I feel that that's a lot of feelings, that if United States is not using nuclear weapons, then they must be afraid of Russia. And really, Putin has America by its beard, I guess, or whatever, because, you're afraid to use nuclear weapons. Aha, you're scared of me. Aha. How does all this work?
No, yeah, I think that the calculus that goes with nuclear weapons has always been sort of interesting. And I think that it's once again, sort of sad thing about international politics, is that being crazy is actually probably in your interest, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. When we talk about North Korea is probably the most classic example. Nobody's really sure what their dictator is going to do. And that's why you don't see any serious efforts to disarm North Korea, at least by the West. It's because they worry what the result might be. The only thing they can do is threaten what would be the reaction should North Korea do something like use nuclear weapons against, for instance, Japan or South Korea. When it comes to some country like Iran, it's a very similar situation. Is that Iran's leadership is, I would say, sort of like a cult. And what they're going to do next is never really clear. That being said, they are probably easier to negotiate, one, but two, they know that that is what guarantees them security. Look at the neighboring state of Israel. Israel's security is based on that actual thought, the idea that if there is a significant attack against Israel that might destroy the country, that they would destroy all their neighbors. And that does create a check and balance. And do you really want to take that risk if they're going to do that? And I think their neighbors realize, no, it's probably not worth taking that risk.
But
so
Putin clearly doesn't care about his people, any people. People and Putin are two different things.
They are two different things. That is true. Putin does not care about his people. I think it's very clear. Putin does not care all about his people. But I think he views it in his own mind, and he's not a good strategist, but in his own mind, he thinks he is, that he's the grand chess player. And I think that he views this as having the world sort of in check. And how it plays out from here is unclear, but he does view himself to have really worked out a clever strategy. But once again, there are other challenges to that theory. And the most clear one is that should he do something like that, I think that the consequences from both the West as well as from China would just be so damaging to his regime. I don't see his ability to stay in power. And that is what he cares about.
Well, as Hodges and others have said, that Putin's nuclear weapon works, functions until it's used. Once it's used, then it's no longer, then it's finished. Which is why, it's just infinite scenarios. But let's move on. Perhaps we'll discuss those further because it seems like the subject of nuclear threat just isn't going anywhere. But the question of weapons is an ongoing one, and now we're discussing whether there's different gradations of weapons. There's F-16s and things that of that nature of, I think, long-term guarantee of Ukraine's security. But there's also 155 millimeter artillery that is are we running out of things in the United States? And this is where questions that I get from Ukrainian TV is, so you're saying you don't have much, that means you're going to pull back now? What does that mean? I'm saying no, it means we need to make more. We have obligations. This is how we solve problems. We acknowledge the problem and then we solve the problem. Not like we acknowledge the problem and then we bow to Putin. No, that's like a weird decision. We don't do that. But whatever. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we're going to bow out to the lack of weapons. Obviously, it does complicate things. That being said, my hypothesis this whole time has been that the military knows, our military that is, they could look at the burn rate months ago and realize how things were going and whether or not they were going to run out of weaponry. This isn't something they just drop by one day to arsenal and realize, oh, look, we're lacking at the comms. I'm pretty sure they knew this was coming. That being said, that's why I think that they've already put into place things. I think the decision, for instance, like cluster munitions, I don't think was something that they just came up with as a quick solution. I'm pretty sure they'd studied that for months to come to the conclusion this is probably the best option for today. And when it comes to everything else, such as the F-16s, I'm pretty sure that's a decision. Well, we know it's a decision they've been looking at for months and months and months. But it is one that, unfortunately, I think it's going to be a very slow decision still. I think there's going to be a lot of effort and time put into preparing how this will all function. But still, as far as it goes with more artillery, yes, absolutely. Ukraine does need more of it. And to be fair, I'm probably one of the most surprising things this war to me was that the U.S. doesn't have sort of an endless arsenal of weapons to choose from. Given how large our military is, how much our military costs, the fact that we don't have just more at the comms than what Ukraine has been able to use. I mean, it's relatively speaking, the U.S., which is globally present, it doesn't have enough to supply Ukraine, which is relatively small. It sort of surprised me. I would have thought that we had a lot more, but I guess not. So
it's interesting because you talk about it from the from logistical point of view. This is a logistics problem. But what I feel is often I run into is when I'm being asked about this is some kind of an assumption of nefarious motive. That this is this is a plot against Ukraine by America. I'm going, what? So again, your take.
Actually, you're right. So that argument I have heard. And I make the counterpoint that I just made is that it's not true. But I have heard that. I've heard that the U.S. is, trying to, you've heard this too, is that the U.S. is trying to burn down Russia using Ukraine, which is something that the Russians also say themselves. And that's why they're spilling weapons over to Ukraine, not in the numbers sufficient to beat Russia immediately, but to drag this out as long as possible, destroy as many tanks and artillery as possible, which would then, debilitate Russia for the future. And so it's part of a grand strategy of the U.S., which, is apparently false and absurd. But many people believe this. And once again, Russia, we know, is pushing that narrative. We know that Russia has been active in telling people that. So, yeah, some people unfortunately believe that to be the case, as much as it is obviously not the case.
How do you view the role of propaganda? Where are people getting their information? I think you're doing a fantastic job on Twitter for now. Maybe there will be other social media platforms. But how informed are people, do you feel, in Ukraine about what's going on, and what is the intent, the ability, the status of Western help?
So it's interesting. So how does the population feel? That is actually sort of one of the most fascinating things to me. Not most fascinating, but quite fascinating, is that when you talk to Ukrainians, I've noticed that there's different categories. There's those who are following the news, like every word that comes out on Telegram, namely, which is privately published news source. That is, I could have a Telegram channel, publish whatever I want. And there's some major ones in Ukraine that have 1.5 million people or 2.5 million people following them, and some that are small have a couple thousand. But these different Telegram channels have a lot of following, and they're written in Russian and Ukrainian. So you can, and I think most people in Ukraine and Russia both, are following Ukrainian and Russian ones. So you can see both sides, what they're saying, which, to be fair, I think is actually quite good for Ukraine more than anything, because the Ukrainians don't trust what the Russians say. But it's interesting to know what's going on inside of Russia. That being said, I think the Russians themselves start to see more and more of the losses that they're facing, despite their government saying it's not true. They themselves collect the videos and the photos of Russians getting blown up. So they see it is true. So I think it's a positive thing for Ukraine and breaking the Russian narrative within Russia. But second to that, the categories of people in Ukraine, I think there's those who are following it all the time. There's also people who are frankly burnt out. And I do know people, not a lot of them, but I do know people who don't work in politics, don't work in news, but work, the private sector, drivers, taxi drivers, actually, who was talked to recently, who said, I don't follow the news at all. I don't want to know. It's too much stress. I'm burnt out on it. I can't take it anymore. And I said, well,
that's really interesting, because it is a Russian tradition to speak to the taxi driver, because those are the people on the ground that will tell you what's really going on. And this one's telling you, because I'm just sick of this.
No, it's true. And it really surprised me. It's like, I remember my first day back in Kiev after the war started, there's still an app on your phone which tells you when there's an air raid, where it's located, which oblast that is, which states of Ukraine are under air raid warning. And I asked him what the name of it was so I could download it. And he said, I wouldn't have any idea. And I said, how do you have no idea? He goes, not me, not my wife, not my kids, not my neighbors. Not one of us has it on our phone. I said, really? Why not? He goes, if we're going to die, we're going to die. Why worry about it all the time? And I said, God, it's just such complete fatalism. That's not, I wouldn't say that's widespread, but it's not unheard of, to be sure. And I think the same thing.
No, but I mean, this is almost like reminds me of what we saw with COVID a little bit, where people were just like, you know what, you're going to die, you're going to die.
Exactly.
So that mindset is kind of like fatalistic mindset we actually should be somewhat familiar with.
That's actually a good point. I never thought of the example of COVID. That's a very good example of that. So yeah, I guess it's true. I think there's at some point, when COVID first started, I think very few people were completely nonchalant. As time went on, though, you reach today where I don't have any friends that wear masks when they go outside. So that, time does change. And that being said, when it first started, I think the vast majority of people didn't leave their houses. So yeah, things have changed quite a significant amount. And same thing with the war. Initially, I think there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of trying to learn every detail. Today, it's going to continue as it's going to continue, and it doesn't depend on me.
All right. Well, then, really a minefield of a question, is American politics. And dare I ask your thoughts on who is likely to, how do you see this presidential race shaping up in terms of there are, while it's pretty straightforward with Democrats, except for RFK Jr., who's showing himself to be crazy already, Republicans are showing that there's a number of people in slightly different viewpoints on different issues. I'm asked frequently about what's going to happen in the elections in the United States and how that's going to affect things. So I'm just going to pass on this question to you. What do you think?
I don't know. It's, to be honest with you, I think to guess actual names of who might go somewhere is hard to say. At this point, polling would indicate historically this far before an election, no polling is going to show any substantial differences. And I cite the example of 2015 Republican primaries. When the primaries began, there were 16 Republican candidates. Out of the 16 Republican candidates, Donald Trump was in 8th place, and obviously he won the primaries. He came in 1st place. Ted Cruz is in 15th place, and ended up in 2nd place at the end of the primaries. So how you would project this far out, who's going to win, it's impossible to say. But to those ends, the impact on Ukraine, I think, will probably be diminished. Cannot imagine a situation that is going to turn out really badly for Ukraine, with the exception of perhaps Donald Trump winning the Republican primary. And he's the only one that could potentially do that. No other candidate, just choose any one of them, has a chance of taking a position that's really opposed to Ukraine if they want to win. When you have 65% of the American public that supports something, to take the opposing view on that would be just strategically unwise. And I think, despite whatever they might personally think, maybe they don't like Ukraine, I think they would be sort of forced into a box to have to support Ukraine, at least publicly, because there's just no public support to oppose it.
Well, and I guess the real question is what happens after the election. Because it's one thing to tell voters that you're going to be doing one thing, but it's another thing like, now you're in there. What are you going to do? And you know what? With all of this in mind, let's take a look at the current event, which is attack on the bridge. And potentially, quite possibly, we had attack 9 months ago that damaged but did not destroy. And now we have again damage, but trains still continue to go through. With everything we know now about Russians and Ukrainians and Americans, what is your take on the attack on the Kerchin bridge?
Well, I mean, it's obviously unfortunate they weren't able to completely destroy the bridge. That being said, Putin, right as we began chatting, Putin was giving his speech about this, and I don't know if it wrapped up. I assume it's already wrapped up. And it seemed that he was surprised by this. He was startled. It does also seem that the Russians, and once again, I think this was strategically an important move, because it's bringing more fear to the larger public of Russia that this war is not something that they're winning, and it's not going great, but there's going to be a cost for them. And the more that the Russian public has to pay attention to this, say, is it really worth it, I think is positive. Ukraine also announced its plan this morning, only I think an hour or two after the attack happened. There was actually the presidential advisor for the issue of occupied Crimea, if I recall her title correctly. And she said, once this is done, once the war is completed, we are going to deport a lot of Russians who emigrated to Crimea. We are also we have about 10,000 Ukrainians who are on the blacklist for collaborating with the Russian government. And I think it's sending these warning signs now to these people, these occupiers, that there is going to be a change in government at some point in the near future. And I would so hope that they start selling their properties and trying to get out of there, which will make the invasion, liberation by Ukraine in the near future even easier. That's,
I think that takes care of the major things that the things that I'd like to check on the list. There's also, why not? There's a matter of Zelensky, who seems to be, sometimes he's helping his cause. Sometimes it seems he's not helping his cause. And in the end, he is leader of people, and it's about how effective he's being for the people. Do you feel that Zelensky is being effective on the foreign policy? He was unquestionably at the beginning. Now, I think there's more questions, but nonetheless, Ukraine, I think, in my opinion, deserves support regardless if Zelensky is there or not. But your take on his diplomacy?
Well, I mean, there's definitely been things where I think he's been wrong to speak up the way he has, where it comes off as sort of demanding or arrogant, and not because I disagree with his position, simply because I think that it's the wrong lens to look through this. As much as he might feel entitled to something, how that sounds to ears of the West is not positive. It sounds very bad. And so I think it's just strategically unwise. Nothing personal, it's strategically unwise. To those ends, I think that Zelensky has, changed a lot. You remember at the beginning of the war, or a couple months into it, when he said to Orban, Victor, you have to decide which side of the fence you're on. It's good, you're going with us or not. These sorts of things he's not doing anymore. But within Ukraine itself, he does enjoy very strong public support. I think a lot of people I know, who say they won't vote for him again. That being said, they do currently support him because he's a president, there's a war. But they're upset about other things. His first 2 years as president, where, keep in mind, he did have a very low approval rating. He had 26% in the days before the war began. Today, he's in about 90% support. So I think he has been able to help the cause a lot. I think that his public campaign, his public diplomacy has been incredibly strong. And I totally agree with you, is that Zelensky is not Ukraine. Ukraine is not Zelensky. So there should be support for Ukraine, regardless of who their elected leader is, because this is on principle. It's not because of personally Zelensky. I think personally Zelensky, though, is a very good salesman in many ways and has been successfully able to bring others to the table to support Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of conversation about issues that you're going to find on Rashkin Report. So I'd like to thank my wonderful guest today, Jason J. Smart, correspondent for Kiev Post. And I'd like to thank every one of you listening and watching this. Hit like, subscribe, press those little bells so that you know whenever there's new content on this channel. Sometimes it's in Russian, but more and more it's going to be in English. We're actually on Wednesday, we're going to have a conversation with historian Yuri Filshtinsky, and we're going to be discussing things in English. And he is the specialist, the guy who studies Russian secret services, FSB, KGB. This is his specialty. So definitely you want to tune in for the. Jason, thank you so much for your time. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you.